Retired firefighter Ben Morales volunteers at a rundown youth center. When he saves a troubled teen from a gang, he unknowingly ignites a movement that transforms the entire neighborhood. Before we get started, please write. Where are you watching this video from? Ben Morales sat on a battered wooden bench outside the crumbling youth center, the warm evening air thick with the sour smell of decay and lost hope. It used to be different here. 20 years ago, the streets bustled with kids playing stickball, neighbors chatting over garden fences, music spilling out of open windows. Now it was boarded-up shops, broken glass, and the low hum of fear that vibrated under every cracked sidewalk. Ben tugged his faded fire department jacket tighter around his shoulders, as if it could shield him from the weight of what he was seeing. Retired after 35 years of rushing into burning buildings, saving lives, making a goddamn difference. And now he was a relic. A ghost in a neighborhood that didn't even recognize him anymore. A gang of teenagers slouched against a wall across the street, passing a joint, laughing too loudly. Their laughter wasn't free and easy like the kids he used to know. It was sharp, hollow, edged with something mean. Ben watched, unnoticed, feeling like a man staring at his own funeral. "You did your time," his old captain had told him at the retirement party, clapping him on the back. "You earned the rest." Rest? Ben didn't want rest. He wanted purpose. He wanted to matter. Instead, he spent his days patching up the sagging youth center with duct tape and prayers, while the city council diverted funds to shiny new districts that already had everything. A shout broke his grim reflection. Across the lot, a scrawny kid, couldn't have been more than 14, was being cornered by 3 older teens. They shoved him hard against the graffiti-smeared wall, their faces twisted with something ugly. Ben couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need subtitles. He knew the script: join us. Prove yourself. Or else. The kid shook his head, once sharply. One of the teens punched him in the gut, doubling him over. Another grabbed his backpack and flung it into the gutter. The third pulled something from his jacket pocket. Something that glinted under the streetlights. Ben's hands tightened into fists on his knees. His instincts roared to life. The same instincts that had driven him into collapsing buildings, ignoring the fear clawing at his spine. But now he was just an old man on a bench. No badge. No authority. No backup. And yet, Ben stood up slowly, his joints protesting. The teens hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy circling their prey, sharks smelling blood. The kid coughed, trying to crawl toward his backpack. Another kick sent him sprawling. Ben's heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. He took a step forward. "Hey!" he barked, voice raw from disuse. It cracked through the air like a whip. The gang members froze, heads snapping toward him. For one long, taut second, nobody moved. And that's when Ben realized, stepping forward meant stepping into a war he wasn't sure he could survive. But some battles you don't walk away from. Not if you still believe in who you are. Ben didn't think. He just moved. Crossing the cracked street in long, angry strides, he closed the distance between himself and the gang. His old boots crunched glass underfoot, the sound startling in the heavy silence that fell over the scene. "Get the hell away from him," Ben growled, voice low but packed with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of facing down disaster. He was just a man. No gun, no badge, no backup. But something in his bearing made the teenagers hesitate. For a split second, Ben thought it might be enough. That maybe, just maybe, these punks would back off. Then the leader stepped forward. He was tall, lean, dead-eyed. No more than 19, but with the look of someone who'd already seen too much blood. A scar ran down his jawline like a jagged crack in broken glass. He smirked and pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open with a snap. "You got a death wish, old man?" the leader sneered. Ben's heart thundered against his ribs. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, curtains twitching in windows, a woman hurrying her toddler inside, heads turning away. No help was coming. No cavalry. Just Ben and the broken remains of his courage. But that kid on the ground, that was somebody's son. And Ben had spent his life saving people. He wasn't about to stop now. "I said," Ben repeated, steel in every syllable, "get away from him." The leader's smile widened, a predator scenting weakness. He lunged. Ben sidestepped, faster than any man his age had a right to move. The knife slashed through the air where he'd been a heartbeat before. Ben grabbed the gang leader's wrist and twisted hard. There was a grunt of pain, the knife clattered to the ground. Chaos erupted. Another teen swung a pipe, catching Ben across the shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, but he stayed on his feet. Years of training took over, block, strike, move. He shoved the leader back into the others, buying precious seconds. "Run," he barked at the kid. The boy scrambled to his feet, clutching his side where a fresh bruise was already forming, and bolted toward the youth center. Ben backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the gang. His chest heaved. Every breath tasted of blood and rage. The leader retrieved his knife, glaring at Ben with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical thing. "This ain't over," he spat, voice dripping venom. "You're dead, old man. You hear me? You're dead." Ben didn't answer. He just stared back, unblinking, until the gang finally slunk away into the darkness, their threats echoing in the hollow streets. He stood there a long time after they disappeared, fists trembling at his sides, the pain in his shoulders sharp and insistent. Tonight he hadn't just made enemies. He'd drawn a line in a war he hadn't realized was already raging. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Ben Morales was right at the center of it. The next day the streets felt colder. Ben walked past the old bakery, now boarded up. The papered windows were faded and yellow, just like the rest of the neighborhood. People avoided his eyes, his presence. It was subtle, like a distant storm cloud growing darker with each step he took. "You're out of your depth, old man," someone muttered as Ben passed by. He didn't recognize the voice, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. The youth center was no better. Kids who used to come in for help, to play basketball or just hang out, no longer showed up. The place felt empty, not just physically but spiritually. Ben stood by the door, leaning against the frame, staring at the old basketball hoop. It hadn't seen action in months, maybe years. And now, with his name attached to that fight, it felt like he had poisoned everything he'd tried to rebuild. Maybe they were right, Ben thought, his mind circling back to that first moment of doubt when he stepped into the mess with those kids. He wasn't a firefighter anymore. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man too old to be getting into fights, too stubborn to know when to walk away. But as the thoughts churned, he felt something else creeping in, a familiar, gnawing sense of guilt. Was he giving up on them? The kids in this place needed him, and if he left now, they'd have nothing. Worse, they'd see him as nothing. Just another broken man who gave up when it got too tough. He turned to head inside, but that's when he saw it. Blast. The front window of the youth center had been shattered. Someone had thrown a rock through it, the shards scattered like jagged teeth across the floor. The sound of it, a violent crack in the silence, made his stomach churn. Ben walked carefully inside, his boots crunching over the glass. The message wasn't in the window but in the space where it used to be. The dark feeling that hung thick in the air, a tangible sense of fear. He knelt by the broken window and looked out into the empty street. The silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. But this time the storm wasn't coming. It was here. Then he saw it. A piece of paper tucked under a nearby chair, barely visible in the dim light. Ben unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but clear. And as his eyes read the words, his breath caught in his throat. "Next one will be you." The door to the youth center creaked open early one morning, and there he was. Tyler. His face was bruised, his eyes dark with the weight of something he didn't want to talk about. But he didn't need to say anything. Ben had seen that look 1,000 times. It was the look of a kid who had nowhere to go and no one to trust. Except for Ben. "I need help," Tyler said quietly, standing at the threshold like a ghost. "I don't know what else to do." Ben didn't hesitate. He motioned for the kid to come in. "You came to the right place." Over the next few weeks, Tyler became Ben's right-hand man. It wasn't just about teaching the other kids how to fight or how to protect themselves. It was about teaching them how to stand tall in a world that was trying to tear them down. Every day after the last bell rang, Ben would lead Tyler and a small group of other kids through the gym, through the drills. Push-ups, sit-ups, punching bags, anything that built strength. But it wasn't just physical. Ben taught them to push through the pain, to feel it but not be crushed by it. To stand up when the world wanted to knock them down. Discipline, respect, Ben would say, his voice firm but not unkind. You earn everything. Nothing's given. And if you want to survive out there, you've got to believe in yourself first. Tyler, who had once been the kid on the outside looking in, began to change. His posture straightened. He started helping the younger kids, teaching them the same lessons Ben had taught him. It wasn't about being a gang member anymore. It wasn't about proving yourself through violence. It was about proving you could be better than the world that tried to drag you down. The youth center, once empty and hollow, began to come alive. Kids filtered in, slowly at first, then more and more as they saw what was happening. They weren't just coming for a safe space anymore. They were coming for a way out. And Ben was the one showing them the path. But with every step forward, the threat grew stronger. One evening, after a grueling session of drills, Ben was locking up the center when he saw the familiar shadow move across the street. A few teenagers from the gang were hanging out on the corner, watching him. Ben didn't flinch. He'd seen them before. But this time it was different. This time they weren't just staring. A voice, low and cold, rang out across the street. You think you're safe, old man? The gang leader called. You're bringing these kids into this mess. They're just as dead as you are now. Tyler, who had been standing just inside, stepped forward. His fists clenched, ready to take on whatever came next. Ben stepped beside him, his hand on the kid's shoulder. Don't engage, Ben said softly, his voice calm but his heart raced. Let them talk. They don't control us. But the gang wasn't done. The threats didn't end there. The following day things escalated. Flyers started to appear on street corners, at bus stops, anywhere the kids might see them. The words were simple but the message was clear. Stop fighting back or we'll make you regret it. Ben found one on the door of the youth center that afternoon. His hands shook when he picked it up, the same anger and fear twisting in his gut. The air was thick, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Each day felt longer than the last, the weight of the tension pressing down on everyone like a heavy storm cloud waiting to break. Ben could feel it, a gnawing sensation deep in his gut, as if he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something inevitable. The kids kept coming though. They kept showing up at the center, some eager, some unsure, but all of them determined to hold on to the hope that Ben had given them. Tyler was there every day working with the younger kids, teaching them everything he'd learned. The energy was different now. It was no longer just about survival, it was about strength, discipline, and something they hadn't had in a long time, control over their own fate. But Ben knew that for every step they took forward, the gang took 2 steps closer. It was only a matter of time before they'd make their move. Ben could feel it in the whispers on the street, in the nervous glances from the other parents. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one had the courage to do anything about it. Except Ben. He had tried to get the police involved, had made phone calls, had even gone down to the station a few times to speak with someone who might listen. But each time the response was the same: too many calls, too many cases, too little time. The neighborhood was too far gone. Don't get involved, Ben, one officer had told him bluntly. We can't protect everyone. You're just stirring the pot. Let it go. But Ben couldn't. Not when it was the kids' lives on the line. Not when the only thing standing between them and the chaos of the streets was him. As the days passed, the silence of the calm before the storm grew louder. Ben knew something was coming. The gang wasn't going to stop until they had control, until they'd made an example of the youth center, and of him. That night, as the moonlight poured through the broken window of the center, Ben sat at his desk, staring at the old paper he'd been writing on for the last hour. He wasn't sure if he'd even survive the next few days. He wasn't sure if the kids would either. He folded the paper carefully, placing it in a drawer, making sure no one could see it unless it was needed. The letter read, "If anything happens to me, keep fighting. You're the future of this neighborhood. Don't let them win." Ben looked around the empty center, the echoes of laughter from the past hanging in the air like ghosts. He felt a sudden surge of pride. These kids, they weren't just survivors. They were warriors. His fingers brushed over the fire axe on the wall, a silent reminder of the man he used to be, the man who ran into burning buildings without hesitation. But now there were no flames. There were no clear paths to follow. Only a fight he had no choice but to finish. Later that night, Ben sat in his chair, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. The lights flickered in the hallway, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of traffic had faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. He didn't know how much longer he had before the storm broke, but he could feel it coming. Then as the clock struck midnight he heard it. A car door slamming. Heavy footsteps. The unmistakable sound of a gang closing in. Ben stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room one last time. There would be no more running. No more waiting. It was time to face what he had set in motion, and he would face it alone. The first sound of shuffling boots hit the pavement at 1 a.m. Ben had been waiting for it. The silence had been too deafening, the stillness too heavy. And then, as if on cue, the gang came like a flood. The night air was thick with tension, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath. The first figure appeared from the shadows, followed by a second and then a third. Soon the entire street seemed to be alive with the soft echoes of leather and steel. Ben stood at the entrance of the youth center, his body tense, his heart racing. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The door creaked open and Tyler stepped into view, followed by a few of the other kids. They had come, the ones who had trained with him, who had learned how to fight for something greater than themselves. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about fighting for a future. "You're not alone, Mr. Morales," Tyler said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of fear behind his eyes. Ben nodded, his hand on the doorframe. They didn't speak anymore. The gang was drawing closer, their faces obscured by hoods and masks, but Ben could feel their hostility. He could feel the weight of the violence in the air. There was no more time for words. As the first gang member stepped forward, Ben knew it was now or never. He had taught these kids everything he could. He had given them the tools to fight, to stand strong. And now they would show the world just how far they had come. The gang leader, the one who had sworn revenge all those weeks ago, took a step forward. His grin was menacing, his eyes cold and calculating. "Thought you could keep playing hero, old man?" he sneered. But before Ben could answer, one of the kids lunged. Tyler, with fire in his eyes, took the first swing, landing a solid punch to the gang leader's gut. The sound of the impact echoed in the night air. For a moment, everything was chaos. The gang charged forward and Ben fought back with everything he had. He was exhausted, his body stiff from months of tension, his hands raw from the constant training. But there was something inside him, something deeper than fatigue. It was the will to protect. The fight was brutal. Ben found himself trading blows with one of the larger gang members. The force of each punch shook him, but he held on, determined not to let the kid see him break. Then something unexpected happened. The neighbors came. At first it was just one or two, cautiously stepping from their homes, eyes wide with fear but also with something else, a glimmer of hope. The fear that had once kept them quiet now turned into resolve. They weren't just watching anymore. They were stepping up. They were fighting back. Ben saw them coming, a few men from down the street, an older woman who lived on the corner, a couple of the teenagers who had been too afraid before. They didn't have weapons, but they had something more powerful. They had the courage to stand. Together they pushed the gang back. With every swing, every move, the gang's grip on the neighborhood weakened. Ben could feel it in the air, the power shifting. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. The battle raged on, but it wasn't the same. There was no longer a sense of inevitability, no longer the sense that they were all doomed. With every punch, with every cry of defiance, Ben felt something he hadn't felt in years, the flicker of hope. The gang, realizing that they were losing control, began to retreat. One by one, the masked faces pulled back into the shadows, leaving Ben and his kids, and the community, standing victorious. Ben stood there, panting, bruised, exhausted but alive. And he was not alone. As the last of the gang members disappeared into the night, the quiet returned. The fight had been won. But this was only the beginning. The next morning, Ben woke to a world that had changed. The neighborhood that had been ruled by fear, by silence, by the gang's iron grip, it was different now. The windows of the youth center were repaired. People were out on the streets, talking, laughing, rebuilding. The graffiti that once marked every wall had been scrubbed away. Ben looked out at the scene, his heart full. He had given everything and they had fought for it. They had reclaimed their neighborhood. And it was only the beginning. The morning after the battle felt unreal, as though it had all been a dream. The neighborhood was quieter now, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the calm that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is clear and everything seems possible again. The police had arrived just as the last of the gang members retreated into the shadows. By sunrise, the neighborhood had already begun to rebuild itself. The authorities took over from there, arresting the remaining gang members, gathering evidence, and making sure that the youth center was safe. But what really made the difference wasn't the police or the arrests. It was the people. The community, which had once been paralyzed by fear, was now taking ownership of its future. The kids who had once roamed the streets in search of belonging were now gathering around the center, volunteering, helping, teaching. They had learned from Ben, not just how to defend themselves, but how to stand up for something greater than themselves. They weren't just learning how to fight. They were learning how to live. Ben watched as Tyler stood in front of a group of younger kids, showing them the basics of boxing. The other teens were helping too, some working the register at the center, others tutoring, teaching skills, offering guidance. They were no longer lost. They had a purpose now. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, this neighborhood had been a battlefield. Now it was a place of hope, a place where the future was being built from the ground up. Ben sat on the bench outside the center, his eyes tired but full of pride. His hands were calloused from the months of work, but they no longer felt useless. He had given everything he had, and now he saw the result. It wasn't about the fight. It wasn't about the danger or the struggle. It was about what came after, the transformation. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't wearing medals and there was no grand parade waiting for him. He didn't need that. The real reward was in the faces of the kids he had helped, in the lives that had been changed. He had sparked something that would outlast him, something that would carry on long after he was gone. As he sat there watching the kids play and laugh, he realized that he had found what he had been searching for all these years. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't glory. It was peace. It was knowing that he had made a difference, that the fire he had started wasn't just burning in him, but in the whole community. The sound of laughter filled the air, kids running, playing, and even the distant hum of music from the corner store. It was the sound of life, of hope, of something real. It was the sound of a future that had been saved. And then, as if on cue, Tyler came over, sitting down beside him on the bench. He didn't say anything. There was no need to. They both knew what had been accomplished. Ben looked over at the younger man, his tired eyes filled with pride. "You did good, kid," he said softly. Tyler grinned. "We did good, Mr. Morales. We all did." Ben smiled faintly, leaning back against the bench. For the first time in years he felt truly at peace. The kids were laughing, running, and playing. The sound was pure, without the fear that used to hang heavy in the air. The streetlights were still dim from the night before, but the sun was starting to rise again. There was no doubt about it. This neighborhood had changed. Ben didn't need to be a hero. He had already done what needed to be done. And as he sat there watching the children play, he felt the weight of his years. He felt it in his bones, in his tired muscles. But he also felt something else. A quiet, unspoken satisfaction. He had ignited the true flame. And it was still burning.